We're going to continue our discussion of the American Enlightenment by focusing on writing that exemplifies or demonstrates the limitations of Enlightenment thought, and also the darker, more caustic and destructive side of Enlightenment thought. I'd mentioned before that many writers have pointed out that the Enlightenment has a dark side, that with the supposed light of reason and science and equality and the development of a more democratic or egalitarian ethos with the Enlightenment, there is also at this time some of the first attempts to justify through science and reason and other Enlightenment principles destructive social behaviors like racism and white supremacy and slavery and sexism and the denial of rights and opportunities to women. And as we talked about last time with John Locke, the justification or rationalization for why it is okay to claim land in the Americas where people are already living, and to basically say they weren't using it in the way that we believe is important for land to be used. Therefore, it's now ours, and we will do with them what we wish. I had linked to an essay for optional reading this week from the writer Jamel Bowie talking about the Enlightenment's dark side and the emergence of a kind of scientific approach to racism. We should say pseudo-scientific, although I'm not even comfortable with the word pseudoscience. Pseudoscience, strictly speaking, is using science or using the principles of science to produce junk results that actually do not conform to the tenets or ideas of the scientific method. But the word pseudo, P-S-E-U-D-O, pseudo, as it prefixes the idea of pseudoscience, is sometimes understood to mean like semi or halfway or something like that. And I don't want to give the impression that there's any scientific basis to this in a term like that. So I'm probably going to refer to it instead as junk science, particularly when we turn to Jefferson's essay from Notes on the State of Virginia. We're going to talk about race and we're going to talk about sex in this lecture. And we're going to focus on one of Hector St. Crèvecoeur's Notes from an American Farmer, a letter from an American farmer, in which he discusses slavery. We're also going to talk about Jefferson's essay on slavery from Notes on the State of Virginia. And I want to take a look at Judith Sargent Murray's On the Equality of the Sexes and the critique that she has provided against denying women educational opportunities. We'll also touch on a letter that Jane Addams wrote to John Adams that I think is using the principles of the Enlightenment to sort of call out what the revolutionary figures, the men meeting in the Continental Congress, were about to do in excluding women from participating in the body politic. Let's start with Crèvecoeur, though. We're on page 564 to 565 in the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Volume A. This is the 10th edition. This is from the letter Description of Charlestown, Thoughts on Slavery, on Physical Evil, a Melancholy Scene. The excerpt that we're given of this letter involves the farmer character, sort of Crèvecoeur's persona that he's using in these letters, being invited to dinner in Charleston, South Carolina. And while they're looking at and beginning to grapple with the society's approach to slavery and racism. And he engages in a very anthropological approach to trying to understand how people are responding to slavery. But I want to make the case that while Crèvecoeur is calling out a lot of what he sees in South Carolina as it relates to the issue of slavery, he also takes whatever exit is available to him to prevent himself from really and truly engaging and formally rebuking, beyond mere criticism, but formally rebuking and calling out what an immoral institution slavery is and how it doesn't have a place in America. He's not willing to go that far. We might call him a product of his time in that way, although many others at that time were willing to go that far to make those arguments, and we'll talk about them in greater detail when we turn to the topic of slavery and the way slavery leads to the Civil War as we get toward the end of our course. But I want to point out Crèvecoeur's rhetoric, and I think maybe it's interesting for the purposes of this discussion to think about the way that Crèvecoeur's rhetoric about slavery is similar to or different from the rhetoric that he uses around the idea of sort of the brilliance of the American spirit, how it is similar and different. And we might also wonder from the third letter, what is an American, who is included in that and who is excluded in that appellation when we think about who is an American. It's not that Crèvecoeur's rhetoric is soft or lacking in a strong prose style. It's firm and it has high style to it. Look on page 565. While all is joy, festivity, and happiness in Charlestown, would you imagine that scenes of misery overspread in the country? Their ears by habit are become deaf, their hearts are hardened. They neither see, hear, nor feel for the woes of their poor slaves, from whose painful labors all their wealth proceeds. Here the horrors of slavery, the hardship of incessant toils are unseen, and no one thinks with compassion of those showers of sweat and of tears which from the bodies of Africans daily drop and moisten the ground they till. Cracks of the whip urging these miserable beings to excessive labor are far too distant from the gay capital to be heard. The chosen race eat, drink, and live happy, while the unfortunate one grubs up the ground, raises indigo, or husks the rice, exposed to a sun full as scorching as their native one, without the support of good food, without the cordials of any cheering liquor. This great contrast has often afforded me subjects of the most afflicting meditation. On one side, behold a people enjoying all that life affords, most bewitching and pleasurable, without labor, without fatigue, hardly subjected to the trouble of wanting. But then, he says, on the other side, daughter torn from her weeping mother, the child from the wretched parents, the wife from the loving husband, whose family swept away and brought through storms and tempests to this rich metropolis. There, arranged like horses at a fair, they are branded like cattle, and then driven to toil, to starve, and to languish for a few hours on the different plantations of these citizens. And for whom must they work? For persons they know not, and who have no other power over them than that of violence, no other right than what this accursed metal has given them. Strange order of things. O nature, where art thou? Crèvecoeur asks. His shift into the anthropological aspect of the society includes an anecdote where he tells a story of a clergyman who goes down to South Carolina and delivers a sermon asking that the people as Christians have more sympathy to the people whom they are enslaving, and relates this quote: "Sir," said one of his hearers, this is somebody from the congregation, "we pay you a genteel salary to read to us the prayers of the liturgy and to explain to us such parts of the gospel as the rule of the church directs, but we do not want you to teach us about what we are to do with our blacks." Crèvecoeur looks at the world around him in the South, at the bottom of this page on 566, and asks, "Is there then no superintending power who conducts the moral operations of the world, as well as the physical? The same sublime hand which guides the planets round the sun with so much exactness, which preserves the arrangement of the whole with such exalted wisdom and paternal care, and prevents the vast system from falling into confusion, doth it abandon mankind to all the errors and follies and the miseries which their most frantic rage and their most dangerous vices and passions can produce?" This passage is an interesting embodiment that seems to resonate on the idea of deism, which we talked about as during our discussion of Franklin, as a value of the Enlightenment, a belief that God's world or God's operations can be understood through reason primarily, not revelation. That with the reason and the rational mind, you can understand and appreciate the works of God. We thought about the ways that Edwards tries to use this sort of bridge idea of connecting the old Calvinist, Puritan, revelatory aspect of Christianity with the reasoning and how reason has to lead to revelation. But the deists would argue reason alone can get you there. But the deists also believe that, well, God created the world and can be seen through reason to have created the world. He was largely absent from the world, somewhere else in the universe, doing something else. That after his creation, he moves on from the world. And that seems to be what Crèvecoeur is sort of motioning at here as he looks around him at the horrors of slavery and wonders, where is the overarching moral power in the universe? The passage ends, or the letter excerpt ends with this horrifying image. He's walking to dinner, to have dinner with wealthy people in South Carolina, and he passes a cage where an enslaved man has been caught in the cage, in the sun, in the heat, with birds coming around and bugs coming around, and he's thirsty. He doesn't have any food or any water. He's been left in the cage to die. And when he arrives for dinner, this is all that he says. This is on page 568, about halfway down the page. "Oppressed with the reflections which this shocking spectacle afforded me, I mustered strength enough to walk away and soon reached the house at which I intended to dine. There I heard that the reason for this slave being thus punished was on account of his having killed the overseer of the plantation. They told me that the laws of self-preservation rendered such executions necessary, and supported the doctrine of slavery with the arguments generally made use of to justify the practice, with the repetition of which I shall not trouble you at present." So there's a sort of intensity of guilt here, of a depravity in a society that is treating other human beings this way. And the rhetoric can be quite harsh, But the conclusion of the letter itself is something of a letdown, something of a feeling that there's nothing that can be done about this except sort of cry out into the universe and wonder, where is the moral order? Or to produce a text like this to try to awaken people to the idea, it might be interesting in the context of our course to consider this particular passage in Letters from an American Farmer with the excerpt provided from Bartolomé de las Casas in the account, much abbreviated, of the destruction of the Indies. Or to compare Crèvecoeur's take on slavery with later writers' takes on slavery. What does Crèvecoeur say? What does he not say? How is his rhetoric similar to or different from anti-slavery rhetoric that we'll encounter later in the course? Does he have an obligation to go further? Is it wrong that he doesn't? Does he go far enough? What should we allow for and what should we excuse? Are tough historical questions that we have to grapple with. The rhetoric of excusing is, I think, a very common approach to the thinkers at this time, to the Enlightenment thinkers at this time. It is tempting sometimes to say that they are products of their environment, products of their society, products of their context, right? As Crèvecoeur would say, they are plants that have been brought up and put down in soil and are affected by the air and the water and the world around them. But of course, it's important to note when we say that there were also figures at the time who saw slavery as a moral abomination, who saw slavery as an evil and a wrong, who wanted a United States that did not have slavery codified in it, who created a series of compromises to get a United States that allowed slavery to continue existing. There were passionate defenders of slavery, just as there were passionate opponents of slavery. From the letter that we have from Abigail Adams to her husband John, and the passage that we have from Judith Sargent Murray on the equality of the sexes, we know there were women writing in the late 18th century on the importance of equality of the sexes, and men who were ignoring that. Just because a society chooses to ignore it doesn't mean it's not being said. And to say nobody is making that argument, or that's not what people at the time thought, is to not look deeply into what people were actually saying at the time. Cultural contexts are absolutely important. We've talked about that throughout this entire course. But it's also important not to say, well, somebody is simply alive and thinking and living at that time, and therefore they can be excused for the views or the actions that they did, because that's what people back then did. That is generalizing into the past, and we know not everybody back then thought that. Particularly those who were opposed to slavery and were trying to outlaw it, but especially the enslaved people themselves, who were pushing back, rebelling, fighting back against being enslaved. And as Crèvecoeur points out, the destruction of the family. Jefferson's essay on slavery in Notes on the State of Virginia, where he's writing sort of commentary on laws that are being considered or being proposed inside the state of Virginia. Jefferson was representative in the Virginia legislature. He was the governor of Virginia before he goes on to becoming president or secretary of state, and then vice president, and then president. Jefferson's essay on slavery is a fascinating text to put side by side with his Declaration of Independence, which is why we've read them together for this week, despite the fact that so much of Jefferson's racist rhetoric in his essay on slavery is difficult to read and understand and process. Jefferson is essentially, in this essay, using junk science to justify white supremacy and the laws of slavery. One of the most famous quotes associated with Jefferson and slavery has to do with having the wolf or the tiger or some beast by the ear and not being able to let go lest it would eat you alive. In other words, it's a preservation of the status quo, even though one might be uncomfortable with that status quo. Because the alternative is, in Jefferson's perspective, as a wealthy, well-educated, America didn't have an aristocracy in the sense of like lords and ladies and dukes and titled positions, but if we did, Jefferson would have been right up there with them. It's a wealthy, educated, well-to-do, worldly guy who owned a plantation and owned other human beings. He's a complex guy, but we can't give him a pass for the things that he did or the things that he said just because he was complex and an important figure in American history. And part of not giving him a pass is looking at his rhetoric and understanding it and trying to see what he is thinking, how his mind works. The essay on slavery is full of many startling lines that are overtly racist. Jefferson's using junk science to justify his racism, but that doesn't mean that it's not racist. And I don't want to read out loud from it excessively, but I do think it's important to draw our attention to some of what he is saying to get a sense of how far he was willing to go in print to justify white supremacy and to essentially say maybe getting rid of slavery is the ultimately good thing, but he didn't see how to do it. He lacked an imagination to conceptualize the enslaved person as another person, and feared what would happen if the institution of slavery was ended, but couldn't find his way through that. For all of the high-minded, lofty, idealistic rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence, he seems constrained and boxed in by his provincial racism. Why not retain and incorporate the blacks into the state and thus save the expense of supplying by importation of white settlers the vacancies they will leave? Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, it says. 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made, and many other circumstances will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end, but in the extermination of the one or the other race. He is unable to conceptualize a world that can be a world of diversity, of people of different races, because he believes race is a scientific thing, right? Race is an invention of culture. But Jefferson thinks people of different races are literally different species, or literally different subspecies. and goes a long way toward trying to justify that in a rhetoric that sounds or tries to present itself as scientific, but is anything but that. He fears the outcome of change and thinks change could be more destructive than the status quo. So he would rather stick with a status quo, at least until somebody can figure it out, than to change now, to advocate for changing things now. He says in here, right, 10,000 recollections of injuries will lead to resentment. And so rather than try to fix that now, he's content to keep the status quo and let the injuries keep piling on. That's what the text says. At the top of page 362, again, he engages in racist rhetoric around art. And this is especially important for us to consider because we are going to look at the poems written by the poet whom he is discussing. Whether they will be equal to the composition of a more extensive run of melody or of complicated harmony is yet to be proved, he says, discussing musical abilities. Misery is often the parent of the most affecting touches of poetry. Among the blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. Love is the peculiar ostrom of the poet. Their love is ardent, but it kindles the senses only, not the imagination. Religion, indeed, has produced a Phyllis Whatley, but it could not produce a poet. The compositions published under her name are below the dignity of criticism. So first, he gets her name wrong. Her name is Phyllis Wheatley, not Phyllis Whatley. He also misspells her name, which is with an I, not a Y, in Phyllis, and claims that Black Americans or Africans brought to America on the transatlantic slave trade are not capable of producing poetry. When he says religion indeed has produced a Phyllis Whatley, what he is saying is he does not doubt that she is truly a Christian, which she was, proudly, and wrote about extensively, but claims that it did not make a poet. And I think, as we'll see when we turn to Wheatley's poetry, she is an astounding poet of complexity and gorgeous poetic rhythm. And she is an exemplary poet of the neoclassical style that becomes popular at the end of the Enlightenment, or in the midst of the Enlightenment. Notice even the skepticism of the way he phrases it, right? He leaves the rhetoric here ambiguous when he says the compositions published under her name. He does not say that she wrote them. He just says they're published under her name. That leaves him a little bit of plausible deniability here as to whether he's claiming whether she wrote the works or not. I think he's certainly willing to entertain that she is the author of her works, but he seems also, in the way that the language is structured, to be willing to entertain that she is not, that it might be a fraud. And this is a racist conceit that is leveled against many Black writers in the antebellum period. Claims that, for instance, Frederick Douglass could never have written his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass because the writing was too good. That somebody like Douglass could not have written that. Somebody born into slavery who learns literacy later in his life through sheer force of will and a great series of trickster elements that we'll get to when we read the narrative of Frederick Douglass. But it's a racist trope that pervades the antebellum period, arguing essentially that great works of art that were written by black writers were not truly written by them, but were perhaps written by anti-slavery activists or others trying to perpetuate some sort of fraud on the literary public. He does actually go that far in his next discussion when he discusses Ignatius Sancho. Upon the whole, this is halfway down the page on 632, upon the whole, though we admit him to the first place among those of his own color who have presented themselves to the public judgment, yet when we compare him with the writers of the race among whom he lived, and particularly with the epistolary class in which he had taken his own stand, we are compelled to enroll him at the bottom of the column. This criticism supposes the letters published under his name to be genuine. And if you want to make the claim that that's not really what he means when he's talking about Phillis Wheatley, that he might just be talking in a roundabout or sort of highbrow manner of diction in the text, if that's what you want to claim, I think that claim is completely undercut by the fact that just a few sentences down, he uses the exact same phrase, right? Published under his name, in the context here of directly calling into question whether he's actually the author of the text as presented. Right? So I think that is not a stretch to say that that's what Jefferson is arguing in the above passage. Again, a deep reflection of his racism, that he's unable to conceptualize black artists as producing works of real art. And he uses this racist supposition as a reason to justify the legal and social and cultural inequalities that exist between the races. He's literally what's called begging the question, using the premise, a premise that he's already had in his head, as the reason for supporting a certain position. He's not proven anything, he's just gone around in a circle. It's just circular reasoning. He starts with racist claim, assumes that it's true, then uses that racist claim to reach another conclusion that perpetuates a cycle of the status quo. But he says of Sancho, let me finish the sentence now, this criticism supposes the letters published under his name to be genuine and to have received amendment from no other hand, points which would not be of easy investigation. But notice how easy it is for Jefferson to make the racist claim or throw it out with no justification other than his own racism, but says he'll introduce the toxic idea into the discussion, but then recognizes there's no way that I can prove this. But for the audience, he doesn't need to prove it. All he needs to do is just float the idea. And by floating the idea can take hold. Jefferson ends this excerpt listed here. And this is the same text, by the way, where he explores the value of the separation of church and state, and how he doesn't believe there should be an official state religion, and that laws separating religion, laws should not be based on religious ideas, and we have to fully erect that barrier between separation of church and state, which is where that comes from. That phrase comes from Jefferson. It's not actually in the Constitution, as sometimes people say that it is. But he uses, again, racism to argue that, for instance, slaves in Greek and Roman culture were capable of producing works of art, but he says that is because they were a different race. So again, using his racism to make claims. It requires, I think, of him an extraordinary sense of naivete. He says on page 634, "To our reproach it must be said that though for a century and a half we have had under our eyes the races of black and of red men, they have never yet been viewed by us as subjects of natural history. I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind." So he says that what people like him should be judged for is that they haven't subjected their racism to a scientific inquiry. And they've simply taken it for granted. He's not judging the view itself, he's judging the lack of academic or scholarly follow-through on the view. He concludes that differences become a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of enslaved people. Many of their advocates, while they wish to vindicate the liberty of human nature, are anxious also to preserve its dignity and beauty. And concludes, when freed, is to be removed beyond the reach of mixture. So that Jefferson argues again, when the day actually comes, that there will be some level of emancipation or abolishing of slavery, it must be done under the removal and separation of the races, because he can't see a way forward. And I want to say, just for the sake of transitioning into our discussion of also the more sinister side of the Enlightenment on views of sex, it's worth at least acknowledging here that there are people who go into the 19th century well beyond Jefferson who originally hold these views. Abraham Lincoln is one of them. But in time, people who have a capacity for growth, which is the true principle of the Enlightenment, right? That people can be perfected through reason. That people don't have to subscribe to superstitions or traditions or their emotions. Such people can grow and change, Lincoln being an example of that. Jefferson, not an example of that. For all of the ways that Jefferson is a pivotal figure in the development of the Enlightenment, he's also a figure who is unable to see around his own racial prejudices and racism and junk science. The writings of Abigail Adams and Judith Sargent Murray, that I asked you to consider as well, show the limitations during the Enlightenment of the way that men viewed women, or the role of women in society. In Adams' letter, which I provide as, I think, a historical document, more as a historical document and less as a work of art, although I do want to point out that you've no doubt noticed over many of these discussions that the letter is an artistic genre for people, in a way that it's not really an artistic genre now. I mean, we still have letters that get published, or public letters, or even well-written letters, but the letter is not really a form of literary artifice as it used to be, right? Think about Columbus's letter of discovery. Think about Crèvecoeur's letters from an American farmer. Think about Franklin's approach to sort of a chatty, letter-like autobiographical style. And the letters of John and Abigail Adams. John Adams, our first vice president, second president, member of Continental Congress, pivotal figure in the American Revolution. The letters back and forth between Abigail and John Adams indicate their high level of education and their extraordinary abilities to write to each other. The rhetoric here is beautiful, but what I asked you to read is Abigail's letter to John from March 31st, 1776. This is a letter that is sometimes given the title, Remember the Ladies. There's no letter here, title, right? I mean, Abigail didn't write to him titled Remember the Ladies. It's a phrase that comes from the letter. Let's actually look at that moment. It's on page 591, a little more than halfway down the page. I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. She's literally taking the rhetoric of the revolution, right? Pre-Declaration of Independence. She's taking the rhetoric around the revolution, right? Taxation without representation, and the rhetoric of tyranny, and the rhetoric of suppressing liberty, and she is directly putting it into a discussion of sex relations inside colonial America, right? Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. Now, you might be fast to try to say, well, maybe not every single man, but I think her point is well taken, which is, don't just look to the King of England and say he's uniquely situated to be a tyrant. Everyone wants control in the way that they want control. People are products of their cultural values, but they don't have to be. It may well be the case that sexist values are the norm, the status quo at this time. But Abigail is saying to her husband John, it doesn't have to be that way. Just as the idea of a divine right of kings and everybody serving the king is seen as a status quo, and the Lockean idea of throwing off the government that doesn't serve you is seen as sort of this radical thing, but then later it's not seen as a radical thing, just as that, she says, this may seem like a radical idea, but it doesn't have to be. You can lead the cause of changing it. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and enduring one of friend. Why then not put it out in the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as the vassals of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed by providence under your protection, and in imitation of the supreme being, make use of that power only for our happiness. She's appealing to a sense here of, you do have the power. Use it for good. Bring happiness and friendship and equality to the sexes. Let's turn to Murray now, Judith Sargent Murray, and her essay on the equality of the sexes. I want to take a look at the poem that Murray writes in part 1 that prefaces the prose when we turn to Phyllis Wheatley and Francis Scott Key as writers who embody the neoclassical tradition that really gains prominence during the Enlightenment. But for the sake of this discussion about people sort of constrained within historical moments and unable to see past their own prejudices and other voices that are pushing against those prejudices and the cultural norms and status quo, I want to take a look at the prose component of Murray's essay on the equality of the sexes. For Murray, the central idea that takes precedence over everything else is that the souls of men and women are identical, she says. The bodies may not be the same, but just because the bodies are not the same does not mean the souls are not the same. And she points out, using that sort of logical power of the Enlightenment, how utterly unjustifiable sexism and misogyny and legal differences for men and women are within her society. She talks about, first, how strange it is that the powers of the mind are usually put into the context of imagination, reason, memory, and judgment. Right? Imagination, reason, memory, and judgment, these are the characteristics that are used to evaluate a sharp mind. And she points out how strange it is because women in particular have, she says, invention is perhaps the most arduous effort of the mind, right? Creating something out of nothing, pure originality, is arguably, she says, the most arduous effort of the mind. And yet, this is the portion of the mind that men cede over to women and encourage women to think creatively and make art and not concern themselves with public affairs. And she says, well, if this is the most arduous of the mental faculties, and this is the one that you think is sort of uniquely feminine, then what is that saying about the fact that you're refusing to acknowledge the mind of women in a greater context? She goes on to say, if there is a difference in intellect between men and women, she places the blame squarely on the culture that treats young boys and young girls differently. At the top of page 700, may we not trace the source in the difference of education and continued advantages? Will it be said that the judgment of a male of 2 years old is more sage than that of a female's of the same age? I believe the reverse is generally observed to be true. But from that period, what partiality? How is the one exalted and the other depressed by the contrary modes of education which are adopted? The one is taught to aspire, and the other is early confined and limited. As their years increase, the sister must be wholly domesticated, while the brother is led by the hand through all the flowery paths of science. Grant that their minds are by nature equal, yet who shall wonder at the apparent superiority, if indeed custom becomes second nature? Nay, if it taketh place of nature, and that it doth the experience of each day will evince. At length arrived at womanhood, the uncultivated fair one feels a void which the employments allotted to her are by no means capable of filling. What can she do? Right? To books she may not apply, or if she doth, then those only of the novel kind. Right? That is fiction. And she's not encouraged to read books of science or philosophy or history. She's encouraged to read fiction, lest she merit the appellation of a learned lady. And what ideas have been affixed to this term, the observation of many can testify. She puts the blame and says, we have created the conditions within the culture for men and women to be treated differently in terms of education, so that when they reach adulthood, men having been invested in by the culture and women having been relegated outside of education, then we look at the results that we have created and we say men must be smarter than women, and use the very conditions that have led to that outcome as the justification for continuing to believe that sexist supposition. It's the exact same approach that Jefferson is using with race, that Murray is calling out on the broader cultural and its approach to sex. As argument for the equality of the soul, and therefore the equality of the mind, and therefore the equality of the person, she asks, very cleverly, on 701, I would calmly ask, is it reasonable that a candidate for immortality, for the joys of heaven, an intelligent being who is to spend an eternity in contemplating the works of deity, should at present be so degraded as to be allowed no other ideas than those which are suggested by the mechanism of a pudding, or the sewing the seams of a garment? Pity that all such censurers of female improvement do not go one step further and deny their future existence. To be consistent, they surely ought. In other words, according to Murray, if women can be saved through the love of Christ and achieve a heavenly existence, immortality, as Christian women, right? If that is the case, which the culture says that it is, and the idea of heaven is that one will spend eternity in the contemplation of the deity, right? The philosophy, the history, the world, the beauty, the majesty of God, though she uses the word deity here, which I think is interesting. She says, if we are capable of living forever as an immortal soul in the presence of the deity, contemplating the works, then why aren't we allowed to contemplate them down here on earth? Why are we being limited here? What is gained from that? What is lost? And she says, pity that those who wish to deny women the opportunity to become educated and improve their lots in life don't go a step further and simply say, women cannot be saved. Women cannot live forever. There will be no women in heaven, right? And she points out that that would be logically consistent with the way that they are acting. But instead they have this arbitrary and sexist framework that's been put on that allows women to continually be subjugated to men. And she's pointing out, again, as a great writer of the Enlightenment would, the inherent illogic or irrationality to that position. Murray's essay and Adams' letter to her husband, I think, are part and parcel of an effort to try to point out where sort of invisible boundaries exist within the Enlightenment. We see all of this rhetoric around liberty and education and growth and development, and yet half of the population is being left out of that. We see rhetoric around making something using your own labor and preserving your life and your liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and governments being existed to protect rights at the same time that a government is existing to deny rights to people. Crèvecoeur is entirely uncomfortable with the violence of slavery, not just the physical violence of slavery, but the sort of violence to the family of slavery, and points out the rank hypocrisy of wealthy individuals partying it up in Charleston, South Carolina, while not a few miles outside of Charleston, South Carolina, into the rural lands of South Carolina, there are agony and misery and bondage. And has difficulty squaring that as well with his own feelings about America being a place of opportunity and growth and brilliance. It's a contradiction that he hasn't quite figured out how to handle, just as Jefferson is a man of contradiction. And Adams and Murray are pointing out a world of contradiction. The values espoused by men of the Enlightenment are not being also offered to women. The importance of today's discussion of the darker side of the Enlightenment, then, is simply a recognition that we shouldn't think of literary movements as being monolithic. We can think about certain values and ideas that are common to the culture or to the overall tenets of an intellectual or philosophical movement, but that doesn't mean that we should understand those to be a monolith across everybody. The world itself is vast and complex, and even great thinkers like Jefferson are complex and flawed and wrong at times. We, as practitioners in the history of education and the history of understanding the ideas that have shaped the world, owe them the respect of engaging with their ideas in very critical ways. Critical here in a sense of trying to judge and ascertain whether they're correct, not of criticizing or castigating, but in a sense of reading critically and thinking critically. We do them the greatest service and honor when we treat them that way. When we simply revere them and don't look critically at what they're saying, we don't do them the honor of engaging meaningfully with their ideas. Since before the Declaration of Independence or the Revolutionary Movement, the American colonies have been a place of contradiction, right? Someone like Columbus is setting out for the growth of humankind, but sees inherently the ability to bring slavery into the picture, or to extend slavery into the New World. Someone like Bartolomé de las Casas is at first a proponent, and then later a critic. He's willing to admit when he's wrong, right? People are full of contradictions, and we have to engage with them. We have to see that things people said or held in the past can be held as perhaps incorrect today, or not welcomed into the discourse. But we also have to play a role in at least considering those ideas. Because to box them up and not look at them, or to only read the Declaration of Independence but not read Jefferson's notes on slavery, misses the entirety of the man. And he's much more interesting as a whole figure than he is as a slice of a figure. He's much more interesting as the author of what is perhaps the paradigmatic, lofty, ideal text of the Enlightenment, and a practitioner of the Enlightenment's darkest sins. We're going to continue our discussion of the Enlightenment with an exploration of the neoclassical writing style, and that'll be in the next discussion where we'll take on and come back to Judith Sargent Murray and Phyllis Wheatley and Francis Scott Key.